With blanks and double game weeks coming thick and fast now, I'm here to help you get your strategy right for the rest of the FPL season. Hey everyone, Sam here, otherwise known as FPL Pricey, and I'm here to help you set up your team for the next few weeks in FPL. To start with, let's take a look at my team in Game Week 21. 68 points with a -4, so 64 net. It was enough for a 50k green arrow to go up to 300k. Still not exactly where I want to be at the moment, but we're making up ground, so it's going okay right now. 20 points for Palmer as my captain, very happy with that, and my back three in defence all got 6 points or more. Up front, Darwin with 11 points, 2 goals in there for him, very, very helpful indeed. And Gordon coming off the bench for Trent with a 7-pointer as well, were all of the players that returned for me, and overall that was enough for a pretty decent green arrow. However, there's plenty of planning to do, and with blank game weeks being confirmed now and double game weeks just around the corner, let's get into all of the hot topics to help us get set up for the next few weeks. First things first, let's have a look at the doubles and blanks to come. And I did go through chip strategy and those blanks and doubles in a lot more detail earlier on in this game week. So do go check out my chip strategy video for Game Week 22 and beyond earlier this week if you want a full hour-long feature-length episode on what to do with your chips. In the meantime, though, a quick summary. Game Week 25 is going to be the first double game week on our horizon at the moment. Man City and Brentford are confirmed to have that double game week. Liverpool and Luton are not yet, but they should be pretty soon. Now that Liverpool and Luton are both through in the FA Cup, they can't have their game in Game Week 26 reorganised for another point in that game week because they'll both be playing in the FA Cup when Liverpool aren't in the Carabao Cup final, which means that that match needs to be rearranged for another game week. Now, it's very likely it's going to go into Game Week 25 because the other double game week potential slots are going to be times where Liverpool, at the very least, are very likely to be playing matches in either Europe or deeper into the FA Cup. So if the schedulers have got it right and they know what they're doing, which fingers crossed they do, it should therefore have to go into Game Week 25 now. So I'm putting it in there as a double for the time being. It's not locked in, but it's like 95% certain to go in there. The blank game week in 26 does make things more complicated as well, because obviously Liverpool and Luton getting the double in Game Week 25 means that they do blank in Game Week 26. So a lot of us with Liverpool assets are probably going to have some benching dilemmas after tripling up in Game Week 25. Going into 26 with 3 Liverpool players might be problematic, especially when you account for the other teams that are blanking in Game Week 26. Now, because Chelsea have also made it to the Carabao Cup final, that game between Chelsea and Tottenham can't go ahead in 26. It will be rearranged for another point in the season. It's more likely that it gets rearranged later on rather than Game Week 25 because there are more slots for it to go into. But it is technically possible to go into Game Week 25, so do have a bit of an eye out for that. However, because a lot of us do have players for Chelsea, for Tottenham in our FPL sides at the moment, it might mean that we've got 5, 6, maybe even 7 players who blank in Game Week 26 in our side by the time we get there. So a little bit of planning is required to navigate those 2 weeks. So just wanted to give you a heads up there. And then Game Week 29 is where things get really interesting because a lot of teams are going to be blanking there, and it's going to be the biggest blank game week of the season. I will come on to that in just a moment's time in much more detail, but let's skim past that for now and have a look at the other 2 double game weeks, which will be primarily Game Week 34 and Game Week 37. Now, Game Week 34 could also technically be a blank game week as well, because we expect Premier League clubs to get to the FA Cup semi-finals. And if they do, then there's a chance that they could blank in Game Week 34. So that might not be a blank, but it could be. And then it definitely will be a double game week because it's one of the only midweeks available without European fixtures in it that teams will be able to rearrange a game in that was earlier postponed. The same goes for Game Week 37. That's another opportunity, and it looks like it's going to be the biggest the biggest double game week of the season. However, because it's so close to the end of the season, rotation might crop up. There might be sides out there who don't have a lot riding on it. So by that point, they might be putting out their second 11. There might be more on the line for some clubs, and some clubs have a lot less. So it's very hard to predict what's going to happen in that game week. Overall, though, I think the big thing that we need to worry about for the time being is 25 and 26, and then navigating with just a few free transfers across to 29. You might want to use chips for it, and that is completely down to your decision making. I don't want to tell you what chip strategy you have to choose, but obviously the more players you've got in blank game week 26 that are going to miss out, the more likely you're going to want to use a chip to navigate 25 and game week 26. And then of course 29 being a massive blank as well might require a chip if you don't have many players playing in that week. So let's take a look at game week 29 more specifically now, just so we can get a bit of a flavour for which teams are going to be playing and which teams are going to most likely be blanking in 29. So let's take a quick flyby on the FA Cup 5th round fixtures, the draw that we've got, and the blank game week 29, and which fixtures are going to go ahead and which are likely not to. So just to start with, Burnley and Brentford have both been knocked out, so their fixture will definitely go ahead in game week 29, and the same goes for Fulham versus Spurs. Both teams are out of the FA Cup, so they will have that game going ahead in 29. Spurs are probably the most interesting of all of those. Obviously, there's a lot of fancy interest there in Porro, Richarlison, Heung-min Son will probably be back by then as well. In fact, he definitely will be back by then. So there's Spurs assets on the menu for 29, which is great news. Brentford also, maybe a bit of fancy interest there as well. That's really good. And then maybe there's a sprinkling of Burnley and Fulham players that we could have in our teams. The likes of Leno, Charlie Taylor, maybe you've got Jimenez as well. These are players that might be in a few teams and therefore could help you navigate blank game week 29 a little bit. I won't go through every single one of these fixtures on the left-hand side, but it is fair to say that a lot of the Premier League clubs will be heavy favourites in this draw. So I think quite a lot of these fixtures will get postponed, unfortunately. However, if we go down to the second one, really interesting matchup, Aston Villa and Chelsea. Obviously, we need that FA Cup 4th round replay to be played to determine which one of them go through to the 5th round, where they'll be favourites against Plymouth or Leeds. Now, importantly, whichever one of Aston Villa or Chelsea get knocked out in that 4th round replay, their fixture will go ahead in game week 29. Arsenal play Chelsea. So if Chelsea get knocked out, then we're going to have a lot of fancy interest in Arsenal assets and Chelsea assets, who are already really appealing anyway. But it makes blank game week 29 pretty easy to navigate, or at least easier to navigate, if we've got players from Arsenal, from Chelsea, and from Spurs in our lineups anyway. And on the flip side of it, if Aston Villa get knocked out against Chelsea in the replay, then it's West Ham versus Villa, which will definitely go ahead in 29. Now, again, there's fancy interest in both of those two teams, probably not quite as much as Arsenal and Chelsea, but there's a lot of managers out there who have players who do play for West Ham or Aston Villa. So that will be really helpful to navigate blank game week 29. Outside of that, though, there's going to be a lot of blanks. I think it's fair to say that Newcastle, Liverpool, and Man City are all going to be heavy favourites in their respective ties. So it's likely that all of their games are going to get postponed. Not definite. Obviously, we don't know that for sure. But I think it's fairly safe to assume that most of those matches will get postponed for the time being, and we won't be able to use their players. And then obviously Wolves versus Brighton as well is an all Premier League clash. If Brighton go through, then we know that Man City game is going to be off in 29. If Wolves go through, then we know that the Wolves-Bournemouth game is going to be off as well. And that's a little bit frustrating as well, because Bournemouth against Leicester, that does seem like a game that could spring a little bit of a surprise. Leicester have been very good in the Championship, so I wouldn't be massively surprised to see Leicester progress through that round. However, because it's Wolves against Brighton, they might also go through, so therefore that game will probably be called off anyway. So it looks likely that we're going to have a lot of blanks, but luckily there might be a few teams in there that still make it easy enough to navigate 29 without taking a free hit into account, or maybe even just a few free transfers and a hit to get you to 9 or 10 players in blank game week 29. So two midfielders that are taking all the headlines at the moment, and a lot of transfers in on both of them, are De Bruyne and Jota. And to be fair, I'll probably pile in Richarlison to this section as well very quickly. All three of which are very, very interesting players to bring in this game week. And I wouldn't have any sort of issue with anyone bringing in one of these players. However, it would be remiss of me if I didn't mention some of the drawbacks in relation to these players as well, especially when we're considering our strategy for the weeks ahead, which is, of course, the theme of this video. Now, we'll start with Kevin De Bruyne. I think the positives are obvious. He's a highly explosive player. Burnley at home in game week 22, and they double in 25. And then, of course, they don't blank in game week 26 either. So in terms of the fixtures, it looks fantastic. In terms of the quality of player, again, absolutely fantastic. But again, because of the quotes we've had on De Bruyne, the expected minutes are probably not that high. And even though he could easily start against Burnley, he might only get 60 minutes and he might not even start. We don't know that for sure as well, by the way. And then after that, then every single week, I think we're going to be slightly worried about whether or not he's going to start, whether he's going to get the 90 minutes. And especially when we get to game week 25, when there's a double, it's fairly likely that he won't play 90 minutes in both matches. Even by then, when he's going to be building up fitness, it's going to be pretty tough to predict him to start in both matches. So I think the upside is definitely there. He's a very, very appealing player, and a million managers have bought him in this game week. It's clear to see why, so I wouldn't put anyone off of doing it, but just wanted to sprinkle in a couple of the drawbacks there and the risks that managers would have to take in order to go for KDB at the moment. Not saying he's a bad option whatsoever. In my team, personally, I think it's quite difficult because if I did buy Kevin De Bruyne, it makes it hard for me to get back to Haaland or Salah in future game weeks, or even in this game week in Haaland's case, potentially. So it's not really an option for me, but I do understand why it is for others. Moving on to Jota. Again, fantastic upside. We know how explosive he is as a player. We know that while Salah's gone, he is probably their most clinical finisher as well. There is an argument to say Darwin has been very explosive as well, but Jota has been phenomenal. And we do expect him to start most, if not all, of the games for the next few weeks. With Jota, I think the only drawback is that obviously Liverpool do get the juicy double in game week 25, but just make sure if you do buy Jota, you're not overexposed on Liverpool and you don't have a plan to get out of it unless you want to free hit in game week 26, or maybe go in with only 9 or 10 starting players. I think make sure you assess the rest of your squad. If you've got a lot of Tottenham or Chelsea exposure in your team, then tripling up on Liverpool might also combine to be a little bit of an issue because you're going to have a lot of blanking players in game week 26. So you might want to consider whether or not a free hit is best for you that game week if you did go down that route. So with Jota in mind, I think fantastic upside. We've still got a good few game weeks of him before he becomes potentially an issue around game week 26 for the blank. And of course, it looks likely Liverpool will blank in game week 29 as well. So you might just be able to sell your Liverpool assets after game week 25. But again, just wanted to give a word of warning on bringing in a Liverpool triple up ahead of the double. There might be consequences afterwards as well that you just might want to have a think about. Richarlison, very quickly, not on this graphic, but an equally impressive player right now and a player that a lot of managers are bringing in. I think the only drawback that I can think of with Richarlison is the fact that it's not a double in game week 25 for him and he will blank in game week 26. That's not a massive issue and the fixtures are great, but if you do bring him in, just again, make sure that you're not too overexposed on Tottenham, Chelsea and Liverpool players as a combination, as well as Luton, by the way, just so that you're not in a massive hole in game week 26 unless you're prepared to use a free hit. So again, with all of these midfielders, fantastic upside. Don't want to put off anyone buying any one of these, but just wanted to mention some of the drawbacks that you might want to consider in your thinking for the weeks ahead that might not be necessarily apparent for this immediate game week in 22. Obviously, we've got free transfers to sort it out between now and then, but I think with the doubles and the blanks coming, there are going to be other moves that you're going to want to make as well. So it's just worth planning it out in advance to see whether or not buying one of these midfielders might leave you with a slight issue down the line. So let's take a quick look at the captaincy matrix ahead of game week 22. And first and foremost, I just want to say that I think Man City assets are probably the most appealing options. And if Haaland or De Bruyne are confirmed as starters this game week, the armband is most likely going to be on one of them in terms of the popular picks at the moment. In terms of the most high upside, they are going to be the two really appealing assets. However, I think it's pretty unlikely we get full confirmation that either of them are going to start the match. So without that, I think Foden and Alvarez are absolutely fine. I think with that in mind, I marginally prefer Foden personally because I'm quite a cautious manager. And I think because we don't know how many minutes Haaland is likely to play, he could easily get subbed on for Alvarez around 60 minutes, for example, and Alvarez could be the one that makes way around the hour mark. Now, that's not certain. Obviously, anything can happen, and Pep does mix it up quite a lot. So Foden could be the one that gets subbed off as well, but I think it's slightly more likely that Alvarez is the one that's taken off and Foden continues. With that in mind, I would slightly favour Foden over Alvarez for the captaincy right now. But whatever happens, I think if we know that a Man City player is starting, they immediately become a very good captaincy option. After that, a few other options I wanted to quickly throw in the mix as well if you weren't massively convinced on Man City assets, which is absolutely fine, by the way, because it is hard to predict the expected minutes on any of them. But after that, Bukayo Saka, yes, he was incredibly frustrating in the last match. Unlucky not to get given the assist, by the way, as well, because he did actually get the assist as far as Opta was concerned eventually. But he has been slightly disappointing to a few managers recently. With that in mind, though, I still really don't mind him as a captaincy option away at Nottingham Forest. Ollie Watkins has, on paper, a pretty tough fixture against Newcastle, but over the last 6 game weeks, Newcastle have been one of, if not the worst defence statistically. So again, I do not mind that as a very differential captaincy option. He'll be highly owned, but in terms of captaincy, I think he'll be very differential. After that, Liverpool assets. I put Darwin here, but this is just as applicable to Jota as well. Against Chelsea at home, Chelsea do raise their game against the better opposition this season, but I think that's going to be a bit of a belter of a game. I can see Liverpool scoring 2 or 3 in that as well, so I wouldn't be massively put off captaining a Liverpool asset, although that being said, I do prefer the other options for the time being. And then finally, one player that I'm jealous that I don't have in my side in Game Week 22, I don't have a plan to get him at the moment, is Richarlison. His data since Son has been shifted out wide and then obviously went off to the Asia Cup. He's been playing central. His data has been phenomenal. 6 goals in 6 games as well. Brentford at home is, again, on paper, not a bad fixture. The one thing I would say, and there has been a lot of hype on Richarlison being a captainable option this game week, wouldn't want to put anyone off it massively, but again, the way I would interpret that is Brentford do play with 3 at the back. Spurs will play with 1 up top. That might mean that Richarlison could get a little bit isolated with 3 matching up directly against him. And then the other thing to mention is Brentford's underlying defensive data is actually surprisingly very good. So again, on paper, a good fixture, and Tottenham are likely to score against anyone. We know how attacking they are. So that probably outweighs the fact that Brentford are quite good at the back in terms of the data at the very least. But I think weighing it up against some of the other options, especially the Man City options this week, I would slightly prefer them against a Burnley side that look very, very open. And Man City, as we know, are very good going forward as well. So again, all of these are options. I wouldn't have a massive issue with people captaining any of them. But personally for me, I think I slightly favour the City assets. And as it stands, mainly because he's in my side at the moment, I do prefer Phil Foden for the time being. So taking a look at how I'm set up ahead of Game Week 22, I do have that 12 million in the bank and a free transfer yet to use. So I can easily get back to Erling Haaland if I wanted to. And there are 2 options that I'll discuss in just a moment. I think outside of a Man City player, I'm pretty content with rolling. So if there was a Man City player that took my fancy, I might be tempted to move that way. But outside of that, I'm pretty well set up. I expect Trent Alexander-Arnold, after getting minutes off the bench in the FA Cup, to come back in and start against Chelsea. And even if he didn't, Garnacho first sub against Wolves away from home, I don't think is a massive nightmare either. Outside of that, I think a back 4 this week. I don't usually like playing a back 4, but all of them are pretty decent options. So I'm happy enough with starting all of them for now. In the midfield, I've only got Man City coverage in the form of Phil Foden. As I mentioned, he is my preferred captaincy option as it stands. And that is based on the fact that we don't know that Erling Haaland is going to start at the moment. Saka, I think, is a second favourite for me in my team. And then outside of that, Palmer on penalties, I'm not going to bench him even against tougher opposition like Liverpool. I expect him to be so important to the way that Chelsea's set up at the moment that if anyone's going to get anything for Chelsea, it will be him. So I don't want to bench him. Gordon away at Aston Villa. I don't love it as a fixture, but I marginally prefer it to Garnacho and Man United in general at the moment. So happy enough starting him. Up front, Watkins and Darwin, both options that I could look at selling in the next few game weeks. But because Liverpool look likely to get that double in 25, Darwin is more difficult to sell than he probably was previously. And even though there are other options there, I'm pretty happy with them both for the time being. There is a transfer that I could make at the moment, and it is heavily dependent on fitness. So let's have a quick look at that at the moment. So fairly obvious this one. If Haaland is confirmed fit and we know he's going to get good minutes in game week 22, I will be basically moving heaven and earth to make sure he's in my starting 11. Now, Darwin was initially the player that I had on paper to sell for Haaland all along. So for the last few game weeks, I've been biding my time, just holding on to Darwin whilst Haaland regains fitness. And as soon as Haaland was fit, I was going to move him in for Darwin. However, given the way Darwin's been performing recently, I'm actually fairly happy to keep hold of him for the time being, especially with that double game week in 25 and the fact that he's kind of stepped up in the absence of Mo Salah as well. So I'm pretty happy to hold him. And the other option I'm now looking at is just selling Cameron Archer for Haaland in a straight swap because I've got 12 million in the bank. Now, if I did that, I start maneuvering to a 3-4-3 rather than a 3-5-2. And Garnacho becomes my 8th attacker week in, week out. Now, what that does for my budget is a little bit problematic because it makes it slightly more difficult for me to get back to Mo Salah by game week 25. But given the news we've got on Mo Salah at the moment and the fact that he's pretty 50-50 whether or not he's going to be back by game week 25, I'm pretty tempted to just spend the money, bringing Erling Haaland if he's given that green tick, he's going to be fit for game week 22, get that sorted, and then worry about whether or not I need Mo Salah come game week 25. And if I need to take a hit to bring him in at that point, then so be it. In the meantime, though, I'm pretty tempted to take that risk and use the money. And maybe if I have to and Salah's not fit, then I can just bring in Diogo Jota in game week 25 instead. And then I've got the maximum Liverpool coverage then without having to use all of that extra budget. The logic for selling Darwin was always going to be it makes it easy for me to still buy Mo Salah in game week 25. But if he's not confirmed fit by then, it's going to look pretty risky to have all of that money sat in my bank for a few weeks yet, when I could get the benefit of it right here and now. And then by 25, he might not even be fit. Game week 26, he blanks. And then game week 29, it looks pretty likely Liverpool are going to blank as well. So overall, I think the more sensible play would now be to use the money if Erling Haaland is confirmed fit. However, because I think it is fairly unlikely he is going to be confirmed fit for the time being, as it stands, I think I'm likely to just roll the transfer, not have much City coverage in that Burnley game, which I'm not particularly happy about. But I think for the sake of future moves, unless it's Erling Haaland, I'm pretty happy to just leave it as it is for the time being. So there's my team selection ahead of game week 22. Not quite locked in just yet, but it all depends on the fitness of Erling Haaland. In the meantime, leave any questions you've got ahead of game week 22's deadline in the comments below, and I'll get back to you all as soon as I can. For the time being though, if you could leave a like and subscribe, that would be greatly appreciated, and I'll see you as we start preparing for game week 23 later on this week.